You are listening to the Vichar Manthan podcast.
Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Vichar Manthan podcast, a project looking to explore the modern world through a dharmic lens. Vichar Manthan is a non-profit public discussion platform based in the United Kingdom. Our mission is to host in-depth public discussions that lead to new ideas on challenges facing society grounded in a sustainable and dharmic lens. I'm your host Sumit Sharma and it gives me great honor to host this project. Very excited today to introduce to you Gopal D. Patel, who is the founder and co-director of an organization called Bhumi Global. Now, I know we'll go into more details with Gopal G specifically around what he does, but I just wanted to read a quick bio from the research that we've done. Gopal G is a faith-based environmental activist, campaigner, and consultant. For more than a decade, he has spearheaded environmental initiatives that engage religious communities and leaders in India, East Africa, Europe, and North America. He's the co-founder and director of Bhumi Global, a non-profit organization that works to educate and mobilize Hindu communities globally for environmental action. He's also got several other chairs and co-chairs in and around the United Nations, which I'll speak to you more about. So Gopalji, namaste and welcome to the VM podcast.
Namaste, Sumitji. Nice to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And really very interested to hear what takes a young man like yourself to go and follow the passions that you have. So maybe let's start there. Where did your passions first arrive in the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. And, as a Hindu, it's hard to answer a question like that. Did it start in this life? Did it start many lives ago? Who knows where it started? But I'll, to keep it short, because we don't have all the time in the world, I think briefly, I grew up in Northwest London. Around the age of 16, 17, I got really interested in Hinduism, specifically the Bhagavad Gita, started associating with ISKCON at the Bhaktivedanta Manor. Fast forward a couple of years, I became a brahmachari, lived in India, lived at the Manor for a couple of years. And then I started working at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, where we were starting a project engaging Hindu groups on climate change. And my background was in computer science, like many Indian boys, like yourself, but somehow my life took a turn towards religion and spirituality, and then towards climate change and the intersection of religion, spirituality, and climate change. And so I started that work back in 2009 at Oxford and did it for over a decade there. And through that, met amazing people and brought me here to the US, where I live now, and working with organizations like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and so on, bringing Hindu and other religious spiritual viewpoints to this global concern of climate change and environmental loss.
Wow. Okay. So thank you for summarizing. I want to pick on a few points that you kind of mentioned along the way. So you were doing computer science.
I was, yeah. I'm going to show my age, but I started my undergrad in 2001. So that was around when it was right before or right around the dot-com bust or boom, it was around that time. And so, so I did computer science at Oxford Brookes University, which is the real university.
Okay, we'll let you have it.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you studied in that space, because you must have been interested in some sort of IT, that relates to what you do now? Is there some underlying connectivity there?
It's a good question. I try to understand the connections or make the connections. I'm not sure. I think there's something about the Hindu worldview or the Hindu lens which is aligned to maths and science and engineering. And I don't know what that connection is, but I think there must be some kind of connection, because it's no accident that the heads of all the big tech firms are from Hindu backgrounds.
It's true. It's very true.
So there must be some connection, but I'm not smart enough to work that out. And I know you work in tech, so maybe you...
I've got a theory. I mean, so the way the modern computer systems are written and sort of the binary systems and all that are based on Sanskrit. So fundamentally, the way the chipsets and everything's put together programmatically, there's 8 bits in a byte and what have you, and that's actually 7 options and 0, so 0 is always an option.
Right.
And that actually, I think, comprehends to the way that we also make decisions. Brain can process into 8 compartments, and then so I don't know, maybe there's something there. But no, yeah, very interesting. Also, I've got another theory about Hinduism, is that it's the open source of religions.
Yeah, I say that often.
Almost anything can plug into it, and it's very dynamic and adaptable, and not stuck by any sort of time period or any scripture necessarily, or at least in singular. But cool. Let's move on. So, Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. When did Bhumi Global come about?
So Bhumi Global, so at Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, Bhumi Project was launched in 2009. And it ran at Oxford Bhumi Project from 2009 to about 2020 till the pandemic. And then Bhumi Global is the spin out of Bhumi Project out of Oxford when we became a registered nonprofit here in the United States. So Bhumi Global has been around since the summer of 2020, but Bhumi Project was the precursor to that. So in totality, this work that I've been leading has been going on since 2009, just in different institutional homes.
Sure. And for anyone that doesn't know, what is the Bhumi Project? What,
Yeah, so Bhumi Project, Bhumi Global, what we do is we aim to educate and engage and empower Hindu communities and leaders and individuals right across the world to address what we call the triple planetary crisis, which is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So what we do is we don't try to promote Hinduism, but we believe that caring for the earth is a central tenet or idea within Hinduism or Hindu schools of thought. And so we try to use the language and the kind of the messaging and the frameworks that Hinduism offers to encourage people to be more environmentally conscious and actually do something practical to protect the earth.
That's an interesting, it's almost like you're using the religion, but it doesn't have to be stated so. And I use the term religion very loosely because by definition. Is there, why is that? Do people need to be distanced from the concept of a religion or guidelines, principles, or has it just, do you think it's worked better for what you're trying to do?
You know, what I say when it comes to environmental issues, which I assume most of the listeners are aware of, is that, you know, there's no silver bullet. There's not one solution to addressing the environmental crisis. You know, it has to do with financing, technology, policy, private sector, civil society, activism, right? And then faith, religion, spirituality also has to play a role in that. And so, you know, there are 1 point something billion Hindus in the world. You know, we have a lot of institutional power when it comes to temples and our sampradayas and so on. We run a number of schools and media companies and different things like that. And so it's just another way to activate people for action, right? Some people will act on climate because they think it's the economic thing to do, or it's the best thing to do from a policy perspective or from like a business perspective. And some people will be like, well, my religion is teaching that I have to care for the earth. Sure. And so if my religion is teaching that I want to be considered a good practitioner of my religion, I should also care for the earth in a similar way. So it's not the silver bullet, but it's what we at the UN call a whole of society approach, which is everyone should feel like they're contributing to the solution. And engaging religious and spiritual communities is just one aspect of everyone contributing as much as they can.
Which leads me on to, so you're also the co-chair of the United Nations Multi-Faith Advisory Council, and also a member of the advisory board to the UN's Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So what role does a faith, quote unquote, faith leader bring to a diversity conversation?
You mean diversity conversation in terms of those UN roles, or you mean in terms of like diversity and inclusion work?
A bit of both. Let's do diversity inclusion first, because then maybe UN makes more sense.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't do any diversity and inclusion work. I know people who do, and I know that there are increasing conversations, at least here in the United States, around how religion isn't often part of the diversity and inclusion conversation. It's often around race and gender and disability and so on, which is all good. And I think slowly religion is coming into that conversation. I'm certainly hearing practitioners talk about that more often. So I think that's a welcome addition to DE&I, because I think a lot of us come from religious and spiritual persuasions. But I'm not directly involved in that, but certainly know people who are doing that work.
So, Gopal, you tell me, at what point is multi-faith a part of the conversation when it comes to solving things like climate change? Like, one would argue it's got to be about the sciences and data. What part does faith have to play in that?
Yeah, it's a good question, because oftentimes a lot of people ask the same question: well, why religion? Religion is a source of all evil, or religion is like hocus pocus stuff. You know, like what application does it have to real world concerns? And the data and the research has been done that, for example, religious groups in total manage are the second or the third largest investing block in total.
Wow.
Religious groups in total have founded and run 50% of all schools globally. Religious groups in total own about 7% of all the habitable land on the planet, right? And further research has been done. So if you put all the religious groups together, there's an immense power there in terms of their real world assets, but then also their influence as well, like imams, priests, rabbis, swamis, every day, every week, every month, giving lectures and pravachans and satsangs are a real way to kind of amplify a message to every community in the world, right? And so there's immense power and immense reach with religious communities. And then there's also the ideas of religion. Religion in its totality of all the different faith groups in the world have, in many ways, shaped the modern world for good and bad.
Yeah.
Right. And even our modern institutions reflect certain religious and spiritual understandings. And so the question often then isn't why do it, but why not? Because if you see the power and the reach and the history, they become a natural ally to address issues of climate change and other global challenges as well.
Sure. So clearly there's a reason. And you mentioned the triple crisis. So,
Right.
so climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And I was reading an article that you sent me that also talked about sort of, is it forestation and how a lot of that sometimes is left out of the conversation?
Forestation, yeah. I mean, deforestation is a huge issue. Maintaining our current forests in the world is 30% of the Paris Agreement. So all of these are separate but interconnected environmental challenges that I think every concerned citizen should be worried about, and definitely people of religious and spiritual persuasion should be worried about as well, because we all believe, regardless of where we come from, that the earth is sacred, or the earth is a gift, or the earth is a manifestation of the divine. And so we all have that moral, ethical duty to care for the earth as much as possible.
If someone listening to this here today thinks, I'm a good person, I care for the environment, planet, I recycle, I buy or whatever, they kind of just buy, get on with life, thinking they're helping out. And maybe they're listening to this thinking, there's so much more I could possibly do, but I don't know where to begin, where to start. How do they, could you point them in the right direction?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to have, which is like, how can I do more? How can I? And I think that's a very dharmic Hindu question, like, how do I serve more? How do I become a better person? How do I show up in a better way than I currently am, right? So I really like that question. And it'd be great if all of your listeners are asking themselves that question. What I would say, is, one area I look at is like, what is my sphere of influence?
Sure.
Right? Because sometimes existential issues like climate change seem far removed, and we feel like we can't make any impact on the deforestation of the Amazon or the pollution of the River Ganges and things like that. So I start with like, what's your sphere of influence? And oftentimes what I start with is, what are you eating? Because food is such a central part of every spiritual religious tradition. And we eat, hopefully, at least 3 times a day. Some of us maybe more, some of us less. And every time we buy food and cook it and eat it, we are making an environmental decision right there, right? So 3 times a day, you are impacting the climate in some way, right? Where is that food grown? How are the people treated? How is that food transported? How is it packaged? Is there food waste, right? And I know in the UK right now, there's a bit of a food shortage.
We can't get salad. There's no tomatoes or lettuce or cucumbers.
Yeah.
It's the first world as well,
So I often ask people to start with like their food, because it's connected to so many environmental issues, and it's such a central part, at least in how I practice Hinduism, of my religious faith. Every Hindu festival is centered around the foods we eat,
There's a lot.
and so I think I start with your sphere of influence, and food is always a good one to start with, for sure.
That's a good idea, actually. I will become more aware of what I eat, and technology is in our hands. We can do the research on what impacts strawberries have compared to berries or what have you. But if it's fruit, it's fine, Gopalji, you were at COP27 in Egypt not too long ago, participating on a panel. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I've been going to the COPs since 2015. So since the Paris COP, I've been going every year. This past year, it was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And I was there, interestingly enough, I was there not to talk about climate change, but to talk about biodiversity.
Okay.
Because climate change used to be the work I focused on, but increasingly I'm talking about biodiversity, which means, mountains and rivers and oceans and trees and wildlife and aquatics. And so I was there in a climate conference talking about biodiversity because increasingly the climate conversation is embracing the biodiversity conversation as well. Before they were separated out. And so I was there, spoke at a number of 2 panel sessions and I think a press conference as well, talking about the work we're doing as a Hindu organization on biodiversity, but also talking about the work we're doing with other faith groups through the United Nations on addressing the biodiversity crisis. And the COP is a bit of a show, for those who've been or have seen it on TV, it can seem a bit overwhelming, 50,000 people over 2 weeks. There's a lot going on. But, but I show up every year because if you're not at the table, you don't have a voice, right?
Sure.
If you don't show up, you don't have a voice. So I'm there to beat the drum for, Hinduism having something to offer when it comes to the environment, and that biodiversity is a concern just as much as climate change is.
I want to dive into that bit you've just said about the Hindu identity. But before we do that, I think people can get their heads around what climate change is.
Yeah.
But biodiversity, I mean, break that down. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked because I was going to go there. So people understand climate change. It's, carbon emissions that are heating up the planet, which are affecting weather systems and patterns and agricultural, yields and so on. Biodiversity is a fancy way of saying, I refer to it as the web of life. Okay. So I mentioned earlier, trees, mountains, flowers, plants, animals, fish, nature, the environment, right? Mm-hmm. Everything that we depend on for our daily life. And so that's biodiversity. And the reason we say there's a biodiversity crisis is because in the last 50 years, we've lost about 69% of global biodiversity globally. And in some parts, I'll say that again, in 50 years, we have lost 69% of global biodiversity. In some parts of the world, it's much more. It's about 90% in some parts. In other parts, it's a bit less. But the global average is 69%. So what that means, and there are drivers, what we call drivers to biodiversity loss, and they are, overexploitation of land, taking land for human use or for agricultural use. Climate change affects biodiversity loss. Overexploiting the land for growing food
and all these things are contributing to wider, large-scale problems with the earth. Essentially, our quality of life, air, water, resources, the nutrients within the food that we eat is significantly reduced as a result. So it's a big problem, not just for us, but generations to come.
For sure. Yeah.
Wow, it's a growing problem. So tell me, Gopalji, you're clearly passionate about this. Leading organization Bhumi Global. What do day-to-day, week-to-week activities look like for you? What type of work is it that you're doing to help the planet, essentially?
Yeah, it's I think it's really important for someone to love their work. And I'm very fortunate that I do love my work, and and I think we all should have fulfillment in the work that we do. So I'm very fortunate for what I do. Every week looks very different. So this week, most of my work at the moment is around. I led the religious engagement at a major biodiversity conference in Canada in December. We had a coalition of 30 different religious groups engaging at that conference, and so at the moment, a lot of my work is around thinking through how this coalition wants to move forward over the next year and a half. in terms of its activities, capacity building, programming, advocacy, and so on like that. So it's a lot of calls, a lot of like planning meetings, drafting concept notes. I'm doing a lot. I'm at the moment doing a lot of work around trying to do some fundraising, because with this UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration that I mentioned, we're working with the UN to see how we can normalize the engagement of religious groups in doing on the ground ecosystem restoration work. And so at the moment, having conversations with potential funders to kind of support that work. And in the Hindu world, it's talking with our partners. We're kind of still in the first quarter of 2023. So we're still in the process of working out what our main activities are going to be for this year under Bhumi Global. So it's having conversations with various partners to see what we want to be doing this year. So at the moment, it's a lot of planning. And I think starting from April, we'll be moving into a much more of an action mode, because the first quarter will be over. But and I know that probably doesn't sound very exciting, but to me it is. That's kind of, and does that make sense? I kind of feel like I get paid to like have conversations and write things on pieces of paper, which
yeah, I mean, maybe don't sell yourself so short. You're clearly impacting events and activities around you. I guess your sphere of influence is at least a lot larger than mine when it comes to this particular aspect. And Bhumi Global also had its first international summit a couple of months ago. Why is that important? What type of people were there, and what was being discussed?
Yeah, so we had our first virtual summit end of last year, I think around November time, over 2 days. And, it was important because, what we really try to do is normalize this idea of people from a Hindu background being able to use that identity however they see it in environmental activism and leadership, right? We want people to bring their whole selves into whatever they do in their work. And if they believe and are passionate about the environment, they should bring their religious and spiritual identity into that. And so the Bhumi Global Conference or Summit that we did last year, we looked at a number of different issues around the environment from various perspectives, from various perspectives, and spoke with Hindu thought leaders and like development experts and other religious leaders to talk about how do we normalize this? How do we accelerate this given the scale of the challenge ahead of us in terms of climate change? And that's something that we're really committed to do. And I think that's something we'll be aiming to do maybe every year is do an online convening like that.
Awesome. Glad to hear. Gopalji, what we're going to do is going to go into the rapid fire round now.
Right.
So we're going to ask you a bunch of quick questions and have fun.
All right, let's do it.
If you were stranded on a deserted island and could only take 3 items with you, what would they be and why?
Oh, I'm going to sound terrible. Okay, I'll have to take my iPhone. I'll probably take my japamala, my chanting beads, and I'll take one book, probably the Bhagavad Gita, but maybe not.
Sure. What goes into your perfect breakfast smoothie?
Oh, I'm having breakfast smoothies at the moment. So it's water, chocolate milk, a fresh banana, oats, and some vanilla flavored protein powder.
Very nice. Sounds good. Do you have a favorite book?
The Bhagavad Gita is, I would say that is my favorite book. Yeah.
Sure. Do you have a favorite quote?
A favorite quote? Yeah, it's not from the Gita, but it's one of my favorite quotes. It's from Henry David Thoreau. He says that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation.
Oh, wow, that's deep.
Yeah.
I like that. If you could have a superpower, what would it be?
It would stop my beard going grey.
Okay, fine. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Whatever, I'm learning this more as I get older. Whatever I do in life, do it for myself. Don't do it to please others. Not to be selfish, but whatever you pursue as a passion has to be your passion. It cannot be the passion of someone else.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Could you describe a moment for us where your paradigm shifted?
When I went to India in 2015, I went to Visakhapatnam. I think it's in Andhra Pradesh on the coast, and they had just been hit by a cyclone the year before. And I met these young college kids, and I saw firsthand the impact of climate change on people in India. And when I saw that, it became something real rather than just something academic, and that really kind of firmed up my resolve to do this work even more.
And what was the, how were the people at the time? What were they going through?
You know, like they'd lost their homes, you know, their studies had been interrupted, the city still hadn't fully recovered, you know, but I saw their resilience, and, you know, I saw myself in them, and, you know, and I was just taken aback by just how this is affecting people that look and sound just like me. I always thought climate change was affecting people that had nothing to do with me, and then I realized actually it's closer to home than I realized.
Powerful.
Yeah. I wish I had some questions. If I knew this was going to happen, I would have had some questions. I'm trying to think of some now, but nothing.
No, it's good. It's good. We like on the spot thinking. What does the term sustainability mean to you?
Interesting question. I won't go into a whole treatise of what I think. For me, it means doing something in a way that that is long term and doesn't inflict harm.
I can work with that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, Gopalji, I give my guests an opportunity to make a commitment on the podcast. So is there something in your life you would like to commit to? Is there something you've been trying to do, or a habit you're trying to break or make? What would you, if you wanted to commit, what would it be?
Okay, this is like a sankalpa or something like that. I have to put my hand.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
put my hand on the guitar and say something, you know, and come back to in a year's time. I think what I'm turning 40 in a couple of months, you know, which is a bit of a milestone for me. And so I think what I'm trying to commit to is trying to share more what I've learned and to move out of the way for younger people. I think that's a huge challenge in our Indian Hindu community, where people build empires around themselves and don't move out of the way to allow a new generation to flourish. And so seeing those challenges in our community, I really want to be the opposite. And so I'm really trying to share as much as I can and move out of the way so others can step up. And so those are the two kind of things I'm working towards, and I'll make a commitment here on the podcast that I'll strive to do that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Should we try and make it real? Is there an internship opportunity coming at Bhumi Global soon?
Yeah, we had interns last year. This year, I don't know if we will have capacity to host interns, but definitely always interested if people want to do that. Volunteers, definitely always interested for volunteers. So if people are interested, they can find me on LinkedIn, and, you know, you can share my email address, and they can ping me, and we can have a conversation for sure.
Sure. Yeah. We'll share your link in the description below.
Yeah.
I think we'll do one more. We'll do last one.
All right.
If you had to fight one horse-sized chicken or 10 chicken-sized horses, which would you pick?
God. I mean, the quote from Michael Jackson comes where he says, "I'm a lover, not a fighter." You know, so like I want to fight.
It's a cop out, but all right.
If I had to choose, I think it would be the one horse-sized chicken, because like 10 things just sounds like too much. So just one, yeah.
one adversary. Perfect. Thank you, Gopalji, for entertaining us there. Let's get back into the sort of main topic and some of the. Could you break down what Bhumi means? I realize some people might not know.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, and I'll preface this by saying, like, I'm not an expert on Hinduism. I've studied a bit, lived in ashrams. I recognize there are a variety of flavors of Hindus and, you know, Hindu texts and traditions. And so I don't aim to represent the totality of Hindu traditions. I don't even fully aim to represent the tradition I come from within Hinduism. But my understanding of Bhumi is that Bhumi is a goddess. She is Mother Earth. And that the Earth, Mother Earth, is a living being, who has her own thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and responds to how we treat her, good and bad. And so that's how I understand Bhumi, as being this goddess that gives us everything and cares for us in every way possible.
So we've kind of talked about this a fair amount, but I wanted to pick on it a little bit more. it's clearly really important to you that you've brought your Hindu identity to what you do.
Right.
And I think we discussed earlier that the Hindu identity is plural in nature. It's it can come from many different angles, and even just the way you described the way you sort of want to represent, it's having the values almost built in, and not necessarily needing framework. So what parts of that identity help you shape the work that you do?
I don't know how to phrase it, but like I try to take a bit of a distant view of it,
Okay.
in terms of like, I'm not precious. I try not to be precious about my Hindu identity.
Sure.
Recognizing that even if I think it's the most amazing thing in the world, Hinduism or Hindu ideas, someone else is going to think it's the most ridiculous idea in the world. Right. And so to not be precious about what it is or what I think it is or what it was or what it could be. And so I like to think of religion and spirituality as stories and ideas. And Hinduism is a collection of stories and ideas. And so I really try to focus on the ideas that Hinduism promotes, recognizing that they may be true, they may not, but I really think they're really interesting ideas. And I think they have a role to play in addressing global challenges in the world.
Could you just help me understand some of those ideas in particular? Is there a key idea or a key theme?
Yeah, so I mentioned one earlier, one that we'll all be familiar with, like the idea of nonviolence, that we should strive to live a life where we reduce harm on ourselves, on each other, and on the planet, right? It's a very basic idea. It's found, very prominently within Hinduism, but it's found across all the world, in different ways and in different levels of focus, right? So that's an idea. The idea that we should be compassionate towards one another and the planet. Like that's an idea I think is really important. The idea that we should protect and not hurt the vulnerable, whether that's vulnerable people or animals as well, right? And so for me, these are just some of the ideas that I really relate to and resonate with me when it comes to like what we think about is Hinduism or the different ideas of Hinduism. And I try to use those to see, well, how do those ideas apply to the global challenges we're facing in the world when it comes to not just the environment, but when it comes to issues around like geopolitics, economics, gender, poverty and hunger, making sure you get your cucumber so you can have a nice salad tonight. It's like, how do those ideas apply to global challenges? And for me, there's another part of it, which is like, for me, it's principle over power. For me, I'm not interested in power. I'm not interested in Hinduism being a force, like to kind of be a center of power in the world. What I'm interested in is the principles of Hinduism making a better world. That's
fairly put. And I can see how you've managed to extract away or take a step into a direction, yet I think still embody the core foundations of Sanatan Dharma and a dharmic aptitude towards life.
Right.
Are there any? Go on.
I'll say another thing which I'm really like leaning into, which is like I really believe, as a Hindu who I grew up in Leeds, so I'm a northerner, but then grew up in Watford in the south, moved here to the US about 6-7 years ago to New York. I really believe also that my Hinduism has to be and is rooted in the diaspora. It's not rooted in India. For me, India is not even my full ancestry, because my father was born in East Africa, right? So my mother was born in India. I have no family in India, no real relatives, no property, and so for me, my Hinduism has to be, rooted in the West. And that's taken it's been hard for me to do that, but I just say to myself, I was born in the West, I'll die in the West, I pay my taxes in the West. If I go to India, I have to line up at the damn embassy for like a day just to get a visa to go to India at the moment, because they canceled the e-visas, So like, what does it mean to be a Hindu in the diaspora, right? And you can look at other examples of the Hindus in East Africa. You can look at the Hindus in the Caribbean, a Hindu that doesn't have any ties to India anymore. And for me, like, that's a constant meditation, because I think a lot of us in the West, we are facing that not dilemma, but facing that reality.
It's very greatly put, and I certainly resonate with it. I think they call it the karma bhumi, right? The land
Right.
in which you're going to do your work, and you
Right.
put it well. You know, and for me as well, born in England, I pay my taxes here, I earn here, I spend here. My life is here, and so therefore, this is the work that I do is in this my
Right.
sphere of influence, which is at least here. And
Yeah.
now to the power of technology through a podcast, so that we can speak to more people. But thank you for sharing that, Gopalji. Is there a specific call to action or some pearls of wisdom or something that you'd like to leave our audience listening here today?
I don't think I have any pearls of wisdom, but my call to action, and I'd like to ask this question to you.
Sure.
It's a question, but it's a call to action, which is, how do we want to show up in British society as British Hindus? How do we get, the Hindu community has been very successful in certain aspects of life, in British life, right? In terms of politics and business primarily, right? But there are others like the arts, civil society, activism, what I really struggle with is how to activate and mobilize Hindus to be more engaged at a civic level, which doesn't mean like running for office or running a Fortune 500 or FTSE 100 company, but actually just getting involved in community life and trying to make a better society, a better country, a better world.
It's a great question.
And so it's something I constantly grapple with within the work with Bhumi Global, and if we have some time, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on,
sure.
on that. Yeah,
it is a great question. How do we mobilize and motivate the next generations or even the current generations to do more and show up better? And I don't have the answer by any stretch, but how I try to do that is by volunteering my time with Vichar Manthan, and
right.
I guess I'm fortunate or lucky to have spent some time with people who understand it, and it's constantly evolving. This podcast didn't exist 24 months ago, and we've created something called the Sustainable Narratives Conference, and we've had 2 so far, and they kind of look at humanity, society, and have chopped them up into like governance, wealth, religion, civics, arts, duties. Where do these cross sections come in? And actually in the recent conference we added political theory and political economy. I think the first step is understanding them. Had I not been involved in organizations and circles like this, I would have no idea. I would thought I'd be a happy clappy young good Hindu boy, goes to the mandir, does his Hanuman Chalisa, and I'm a good person, I recycle. But and actually through speaking to experts on the podcast, I've realized there are many ways we can show up with those principles, with those Hindu values. And so the first step is understanding, then it's about what action can I take, what value can I add, and then it's about lifelong goals and dreams and ambitions. Is my attempt. So if anyone listening at home has an alternative, drop it in comments, email myself or Gopalji, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit further.
Yeah, that's a great answer, because I a lot of my work also is like doing things with a Hindu lens, right? And so like, what is the Hindu approach? And if we go back to the Bhagavad Gita, the first thing Krishna does is just educate Arjun. He doesn't tell him what to do. He just like lays out like the landscape of options and like why he's thinking and feeling certain ways, right? And then because only with education first, then can you know what to do and what not to do, right? And so starting with that baseline of education is, maybe that's why we Hindus put so much emphasis on education.
Yeah.
But I love that answer, that education first, then action. Yeah, rather than the other way around, because the other way around is chaos, right?
Chakravyuha, you will get lost if you don't know the way to do it. So, Gopalji, it's been a great conversation. I've certainly learned a lot about what you do. I find it inspirational, and hopefully people are motivated by the way in which you show up and dedicate your time to this non-profit and to Mother Earth, essentially. So Gopalji, thank you very much for joining us on the Vichar Manthan podcast.
Sumit, thank you so much for all your work, and thanks for having me on, and I look forward to reconnecting, and you can keep me up to task with my commitments that I made today.
Absolutely. Thank you once again for joining us. And to everyone listening at home, thank you for listening to the Vichar Manthan podcast. You can find this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, Amazon, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and your favorite streaming platform. The Vichar Manthan podcast is a project looking to explore the modern day and understand it through a dharmic lens. And through in-depth interviews with some of the best thinkers of our time, this podcast is exploring how we can better understand Dharma, better understand our lives, and recapture the ancient and classical ideals of sustainability, liberty, and flourishing. Tune in for an earnest conversation. My name is Sumit Sharma, and this was the Vichar Manthan podcast. Namaste.